Good evening. My name is Evan. I'm the community manager at Boston Virtual ARTCC, and I'm excited to welcome everyone to tonight's very exciting ground school seminar on holds. This is one of the most intense and the most interesting and also the most fun ground schools we have. It's very interactive, lots of opportunity for the audience to participate in some questions that we have and to actually kind of follow along and do some of the entries and other interactive questions with us. So hopefully you're geared up and ready for some fun for the next hour and perhaps even hour and a bit, depending on how long things go. Typically, this session does tend to run a little longer than most because we're covering a lot of information. I will say at the beginning, there's a lot to talk about with respect to holds, and some of it gets pretty detailed, but a lot of it is more recommendation than it is actual requirement. So if you're going for your IFR check ride tomorrow, then of course you're going to need to know all of this stuff. But for the simulator pilot especially, I think if there's only two things you leave this session with, it's these two things. Most important two things about holds are maintain the altitude that we've given you and stay on the protected side where we've told you to hold. Beyond that, we're going to talk a lot about speed requirements. As a controller, it doesn't really matter to me what speed you're flying. We're going to talk about corrections for wind. That's somewhat relevant, but ultimately, if you stay on the right side of the hold, it doesn't really bother me which heading you're going to fly in the outbound leg. And the entries, which we spent a lot of time talking about, well, those are just recommendations anyway. So at the end of the day, when you're flying on the network or you're assigned a holding pattern or you do fly a missed approach, you end up in the hold, the most important things to think about are maintain the altitude and stay on the proper side of the hold. That way, we'll be able to protect the airspace accordingly, and you'll be assured separation from the traffic. So with that introduction in mind, I'll hand things over to Alec, who's the host of tonight's session, and we'll talk all there is to know about holds.
Hey guys, just want to make sure you can hear me okay.
5 by 5.
Excellent. So thank you, Evan, for the introduction. As Evan said, today's topic is a little bit on the more challenging side, but we're going to try to do a good job of getting through it. So what are we going to cover today? Holding Procedures Ground School, we're going to help you guys understand the construction of holding patterns and how to properly fly holds. We're going to cover VFR and visual holds, which you wouldn't find too often in the real world, but still occasionally. How to create a holding pattern, and kind of decipher the hold instruction that you're given by air traffic control. Wind correction, because the world is not perfect. We have wind that we have to correct to. And how to enter holding patterns, which is a surprisingly nuanced topic. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask in the chat at any time. All right, VFR holds. When you're VFR, holding can be really simple. Find a house, find a barn, a lake, and just hold over it. In fact, that's what you do at Oshkosh. They'll have everybody hold over a lake if the arrival field is too cluttered. It could happen because of traffic conditions like Oshkosh, inability to enter airspace, like Class Delta Tower telling you that you can't enter their airspace just yet, or weather. Let's say you're landing at, in this case, Beverly Airport up in the top right of the photo, or the screenshot, and there's some weather over there and you need to hold. You can do a VFR holding entry. The way you do that is by picking a point, or having air traffic control ask you to fly over a specific point and then just making a rough racetrack pattern and always making sure the point is inside either off your left or your right side. Really no challenge here. Then we get into IFR holds. And these are assigned like any other instruction to air traffic control, to aircraft by air traffic control. And there are a plethora of reasons that they could be assigned. Anything from traffic density to weather to equipment troubleshooting. And in the case of uncontrolled airports, there's the one in, one out rule. So they already have somebody going into the airport and you need to wait for them to land. Or a course reversal, which we will discuss in our next couple seminars. So shameless plug, invite you guys to come chat with us next week and the week after to discuss what a course reversal is. Point being, there are many reasons that you might get a hold when you're flying under IFR.
And course reversals are a really important topic. They come up all across the Wings program and even in regular flying. It's fairly uncommon, especially if you're a general aviation pilot, that you'd be holding on a regular basis. It does happen from time to time, but the most common application for talking about holds is actually not to hold, it's to do a course reversal on a full instrument approach. So you're given a clearance direct to a VOR or some other initial approach fix that has a depicted hold or that has even a procedure turn. You're dealing with that course reversal most commonly that's going to be handled just like entering a hold. You're not actually going to fly the hold, but you're flying the entry. So we spend a lot of time, as Alex says, it's a fairly nuanced topic. We'll spend a lot of time in today's session talking about holds, and that's a really fundamental building block for our next sessions when we start to talk about instrument approaches.
Yeah, exactly. Anybody have a question so far?
There'll be lots of those later, don't worry.
Oh, yeah. All right, cool. So what is a holding pattern? Let's get to the meat of the stuff. Instrument hold is a maneuver where you keep your aircraft within a certain amount of airspace and altitude until, for whatever reason, you are allowed to proceed, either traffic or weather or whatever. Holding patterns are defined by a navade, which is that reference point that you use, an inbound leg, and then an outbound leg. Let's talk about the navade. Navade is a navade like in any other kind of flying. A VOR, so a ground station, an NDB, another ground station, an intersection of two radials, a DME fix, an RNAV waypoint, all depending on what kind of equipment you may have. Generally speaking, holds for instructional purposes are depicted via a triangle, so that's what we're largely going to be using today. Now let's talk about the inbound leg. The inbound leg is what all hold instructions are centered about. You always fly to the fix on the inbound leg. That should be pretty common sense. Inbound to, outbound away from. And the inbound leg is always the navigational guidance. And we'll talk about that in a few more slides as well. The outbound leg, on the other hand, you're flying away from the fix. And this one you actually fly by dead reckoning. There's no navigational guidance. You have to guesstimate this one and then adjust for wind and time it properly so that you're always tracking the navigational guidance on the inbound leg. And we'll discuss how to do that in a few more slides.
Is it always on the right or on the left?
Say again?
I'm looking at traffic patterns. Usually they're on the left. So is this one always on the right, or it doesn't matter?
So good question. We are going to talk about non-standard holds, but in opposite to traffic patterns, conversely rather, standard holds are always flown with right turns, and non-standard holds, if specified left turns, then you fly them to the left. Otherwise, you can expect standard holds to be to the right.
Okay.
I don't have a reason for that. I don't know why, but that's just the way it is.
And it's important to note we were just talking about sort of the difference between the inbound leg and the outbound leg, and it's a point of very common confusion. I'm going to try my best to use the pen here, but it's important to note that we're always flying this way. And on this portion where I've just drawn, this is where we're actually tracking. So if you're using a VOR or if you're using a GPS, and you're just tracking radial to a certain fix in your GPS, this is the leg where you're actually following that guidance. And then as Alex says, when you make this turn, at this point, you're simply flying a heading and hoping for the best and basically hoping that this heading more or less parallels the inbound track on the basis of the wind and the corrections you're going to apply. Then you're coming back around to this direction, re-intercepting that radial or that GPS track inbound to the fix. So only on this limited portion of the hold, which in most cases is going to be just for 1 minute, are you actually following a navigational beacon or an actual piece of navigation. The rest of the time, you're basically just flying a heading, and as Alex says, not quite hoping for the best, but more or less hoping for the best.
And there are different techniques that we're going to cover in the next several slides that talk about how to pick that outbound heading so that you do end up on the exact inbound leg that you want to fly. All right, let's talk about holding pattern specifications and the rules surrounding them. As Lane just mentioned, turn direction. Standard holds are flown to the right, and in the absence of any direction, you fly them to the right. Non-standard holds, ATC will specify a left turn, and we'll hear ATC instructions in a couple slides. Inbound time, so the inbound leg that Evan just mentioned, most often, especially for GA aircraft, it's 1 minute. Above 14,000 feet, 1.5 minutes. And we have speed limits as well. Below 6,000 feet, you cannot fly above 200 knots, 6,000 to 14,000, not above 230, 14,000 and higher, not above 265. That's really only an issue for the airline world. I would be pretty concerned if I got a Cessna Skyhawk up to 200 knots.
And even in the airline world, what we hear quite commonly is airliners will just request their own speeds anyway. And as I said before, as a controller, certainly in the virtual world, it doesn't bother me what speed you're flying. So if I'm going to be flying into a hold, I'm going to just end up there to wait. There's no reason for me to go fast. I may as well slow down. So typically, one of the first things that we'll do in the airline world when we hear you can expect to hold or here's a holding clearance for you is we'll just ask for speed our discretion right at that moment. And then I'll slow down to whatever a minimum safe clean speed is, because I'm just going to be sitting there burning gas anyway. I may as well try to eat up a little bit more time as I'm on the way to the fix. And again, I don't necessarily have any reason to be operating at 265 knots in most cases. So I might request speed my discretion and just go as slow as I practically can, or as I feel comfortable with doing, saving some gas and avoiding any additional time that I might be spending in the hold. So that's a good trick for anyone who doesn't want to sit here and actually memorize all these speeds, since we're not going to be tested on that by an examiner. Perfectly reasonable to just say, is you guys are holding clearance, requesting speed my discretion, or requesting normal speed. And again, I don't see any reason why controllers would have to be giving you a speed assignment. It's not like we separate you in a hold one after the other, hoping for the best in your 1 minute legs. All of our separation and holds is based around altitudes. So you're never going to be sitting there in a holding pattern at the same altitude as somebody else. You'll always be stacked at least 1,000 feet apart.
Yeah, and Evan raises a really good point about speeds. If you're holding, especially if you're holding for a large amount of time, slowing down will help you with your aircraft endurance, meaning that you're able to stay in the air for longer. Alrighty, holding clearances, and here is where it starts to get fun. A holding clearance will always have a fix, the nav aid that we're going to reference, the cardinal direction to it, a radial course you're following, the turn direction if it's non-standard, the inbound leg length if it's non-standard, and then an EFC time. So it always has 4 of the 6, at least, but it could have all of them. An example hold instruction is Cessna 5 Golf Romeo clear to Putnam, hold northwest on the 330 radial, expect further clearance at 1452 Zulu. Now, assuming this is below 14,000 feet, the holding distance here is going to be 1 minute on the inbound leg, and EFC times 1452 Zulu with standard turns to the right. Any questions on this one so far? Cool. Let's create this pattern. So, one more time, the clearance is Cessna 5 Golf Romeo clear to Putnam, hold northwest on the 330 radial, expect further clearance 1452 Zulu. We know the nav aid. The holding fix is the Putnam VOR. We can just draw that out right now. The cardinal direction, in this case northwest, defines where the hold is located in relation to that fix. So we know that our inbound leg is northwest of the VOR. Specifically, we know that the inbound leg is the 330 radial, meaning the outbound leg is on a 150 is on a 330 heading, and the inbound leg is a 150 heading. Let me clarify that. If we know that the inbound leg is on the 330 radial, and we're always flying inbound to the nav aid, we know that the inbound heading, or excuse me, track must be 150. And in a no-win scenario, the outbound heading is 330. In the absence of turn directions, right turns. Does anybody
Mark,
have any questions here?
I think Mark had a question in TeamSpeak. Mark, we're going to do all the audio here in Google Meet. So if you can unmute yourself here in Google Meeting just by clicking the microphone icon at the bottom of the screen, you may have to mouse around there. You feel free to ask your questions here, or if you prefer, you can just send a message via the chat. Let me clarify, well, Alec did a good job of explaining here, but probably one of the most complicated pieces of information you're going to consume tonight is this notion of the VOR radial that you're holding on is 330. So your inbound track is the opposite. It's the 150 heading. And we've got that in the picture on the slide here. So the idea is, of course, VOR radials are always defined outbound from the VOR. So an VOR radial simply means you're flying 330 on a indefinite heading all the way away from the VOR. That's what that radial is. But of course, as we talked about before, it would be incorrect for us to fly a hold this way. We would never fly outbound on the radial. We always fly inbound. And so because it's that 330 radial, but we're flying it this way, we're flying it inbound, therefore, we're going to use 150 as our inbound track. And again, that's going to be a very important piece of information later on when we start to talk about how the holding pattern is actually entered. I had a question in the chat about altitude. That isn't necessarily... Go ahead, Alec.
No, I was just going to address both Mark's and Keith's question. You can. It's up to you. I can take it to either.
Sure.
All right. Mark, we'll get to your question in a second. Keith, what about altitude? That's an easy answer. In the absence of any other altitude instruction, just maintain whatever altitude you were previously told to maintain. Mark, I believe you had a question.
I'm going to wait based on what Evan said as to how you enter these patterns, because that's where I do get a little confusion. But based on the language of the instructions, it looks to me that the first thing you do is get to Putnam, and then, then you'll be guiding us as far as how to proceed into the hold from Putnam, but we do fly to Putnam first.
Correct. You always fly to the nav aid. You always fly to the nav aid first. And while on the way to the nav aid, you figure out what kind of entry into the hold you're going to fly. And that's what the bulk of tonight's slides are going to be on, is figuring out the hold entry. Does that answer your question, Mark?
Yes, and I await the rest to help me better understand that. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. Any further questions on this? If not, we'll move on to intersections or DME holds. All right, this is largely the same principle as a. Sorry, this is largely the same principle as a nav aid hold. Only instead of a nav aid, you now have an intersection of two radials, and you just fly to the intersection of those two until your CDIs are centered, and that's what you use as your nav aid. You accomplish this using a long VOR radial, either cross radial or DME to identify the holding fix. There's really no difference between nav aid and then using the intersection of two VOR radials to define a nav aid. NDB holds. You're very likely not going to fly one of these ever, either online or in the real world, at least within the United States or most Western countries, but they are totally kosher, so we're going to cover them anyway. Holding is accomplished at a non-directional beacon, or NDB, and again, you establish an inbound track to that station.
And we don't have a slide specifically on it, but GPS-based hold, so you've just been cleared to hold at an RNAV fix, is going to be similar to this one. And what's important to note about an NDB hold or a GPS hold is that we aren't talking radials here. So when you get a holding clearance for a VOR hold, your holding clearance is going to say hold on the 330 radial. Like we talked about with the Putnam example, now we need to be inversing that and go 180 degrees to a 150 heading to find our inbound track. When you're given a clearance to hold on an NDB or on an RNAV fix, air traffic control isn't going to say 330 radial. They'll make it easy for you, and they'll say hold on the 150 inbound track. So now there's no need to worry about going 180 degrees. You've already been given that piece of information. And that's the purpose of this slide, and trying to identify anything else when it comes to a regular RNAV fix hold, is that that clearance is going to sound different. We're not talking about a radial off of VOR where there's a need to invert the number. We're talking about an inbound track. And again, we'll cover that in the future examples we come up with.
Yeah, Evan raised a very, very good point. So just as an example, if you want to back up on the slide, Evan, notice how an NDB or a GPS waypoint doesn't have any radials. So in the bottom example on that NDB, on the localizer, for example, you would get a clearance like November 1 Alpha Bravo cleared to the Shaker Hill NDB, hold west on the 090 inbound track, something along those lines. It just makes life easy for you. Any questions about this? Alrighty, let's talk about how to fly a hold. First off, and arguably one of the newest parts, perform the appropriate entry. All entries end with the aircraft crossing the fix on the inbound leg, but the parts leading up to it are the trickier ones, and we'll talk about those in the next set of slides. After the appropriate entry, you turn outbound in the appropriate direction, and you begin timing the outbound leg when you are abeam the fix. So the fix is off one of your wings. For VOR hold, you're abeam when the to from flag reverses indication. NDB hold, you're abeam when the ADF needle points either to a 090 or 270 relative bearing. And on a DME hold, you are abeam when the DME indicates the same DME as the holding fix. All right, upon reaching the predetermined outbound time, turn it towards the inbound course. Start the inbound timer upon completion of the turn. Track the inbound course to the fix and note the time crossing the fix. Turn outbound and repeat. Always make standard rate turns, in other words, 3 degrees per second.
So let's just cover that as a summary here. Again, we're going through a lot of information pretty quickly so we can talk a lot about entries, but this is important to remember too. So we've crossed the holding point initially after doing our entry. We make a turn to the outbound leg. We time that for about 1 minute. Then we turn back. We re-intercept the radial or whatever course we have to the holding fix. In theory, we fly that for 1 minute, and we continue on doing that. And as Alex says, we're always going to make standard rate turns, which he's going to explain to us in just a second.
Any questions on the slide? Okay, moving on. Standard rate turn, that's the standard turn coordinator you'd find in most steam-equipped or steam gauge quote-unquote aircraft. Standard rate turn occurs when your wing is on the turn coordinator is at the little notch below the horizon, as is the case here, and you are coordinated, meaning if your wing is aligned with the little lower white line and the ball is perfectly centered, you are flying a standard rate turn. So 3 degrees per second.
And what's the significance of that?
In other words, that it will take you a full minute to fly from to turn from your inbound to your outbound heading.
Exactly. So in theory, everything is 4 minutes. 1 minute inbound, 1 minute to make the turn outbound, 1 minute in the outbound leg, and 1 more minute to turn back onto the inbound leg. If only there was no wind.
Any questions on this? Okay, that was great for a perfect world, and now let's talk about our actual world, wind correction. Wind can have one of 2 effects on your holding pattern. I'm sorry, one or both. First, a headwind or a tailwind will cause you your inbound leg timing to be incorrect, and you have to adjust for that. A crosswind will cause you to undershoot or overshoot the inbound course on your inbound turn, and you have to adjust for that. So when you fly a holding pattern, there are really 2 corrections you need to make to correct for wind. You adjust the outbound heading to roll out of the inbound turn on the inbound course, and you adjust the outbound time to create a 1 minute inbound leg. So let's recap that. Wind pushes us either away or from the inbound course, and also away or from the navigate itself. So to account for that, we adjust our outbound course and our outbound time. Any questions on this so far? Okay, let's talk about wind correction, and more specifically, the heading. We adjust a heading by doubling the crab angle correction maintained on the inbound leg. For example, if you're already flying your inbound leg and you know that you need a 7-degree right crab into the wind, that means on your outbound leg, when you're flying the reciprocal heading that you flew on your inbound, you need a 14-degree crab this time to the left, so you're always crabbing into the wind.
And of course, we know about that initial 7 degrees because on that inbound leg, we're tracking a VOR. So let's use the VOR as an example. You've got your needle centered, therefore you know you're tracking the VOR. If your radial is 330, but in fact your heading is 337, now you know you're crabbing 7 degrees to the right. So as we make that turn outbound, we're just going to double that and go the opposite direction. And that doubling helps to correct for the impact of the wind during those 2 portions of the holding procedure where you're actually making a turn. That's the key to that doubling. We're going to go through a number of examples on this as well, but I just want to point out the key to this being that, of course, inbound, you're actually tracking a piece of navigation, most likely a VOR radial. Therefore, you can figure out how far right or left do I need to be to stay on my heading. And that piece of information is what you use to decide how much you're going to turn when you're flying that outbound portion where there is no navigation and you're simply picking a heading to fly.
Yeah, good point, Seven. Any questions on this so far? Okay. Let's talk about timing. You adjust timing by lengthening or shortening the outbound leg by 2/3 to achieve a timing of 1 minute on the inbound leg by taking 2/3 of the difference in timing. What does that mean? For example, if the inbound leg takes 40 seconds, you need an extra 20. 2/3 of 20 is 13 seconds, so the outbound should be flown for 73 seconds. So you take the difference between your actual inbound and what you want it to be, take 2/3 of that, and then add or subtract it from the outbound. And as a note here, corrections are much less effective when there's a tailwind on the inbound leg. In those cases, you just got to apply additional correction as just determined through brute force trial and error. 1 second of correction per knot of wind component is a good baseline, but adjust that as necessary.
So we're going to go through some examples of how to apply these now. So if your brain doesn't hurt yet, it's about to in a couple of seconds. But I just want to point out again, coming back to that comments I made at the beginning of the session today, this is stuff that you need for your IFR check ride. It's stuff to make your simming that much better. It's the 95% of making that holding pattern work out perfectly. Does it really matter in the online world? Absolutely not. And of course, you know, when we're sitting here, whether it's a wings flight or whether it's anything else on the network, no controller is sitting there saying, your holding pattern is slightly too crabbed in, doesn't look perfect. You know, we don't really care about that. We care about what side of the airplane, or what side of the fix you're on, and we care about your altitude. So this is great stuff. And if you really want to refine your flying skills, these are some great examples to go through. But from a really practical perspective, it's not something that you need to be terribly worried about for everyday network flying. So let's see how much you've been paying attention.
Alrighty. This is going to be an interactive question, so I invite people, a brave soul perhaps, to step up and take a stab at this. So, anybody want to be the volunteer here? I don't bite, I promise.
We can also just have everyone put in their answers in the chat too, maybe, if people want to do that.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's have everybody put in answers. Oh, let's just have everybody put in answers into the chat on Google Meet. So here's your clearance. You are cleared to Boston. Hold north on the 360 radial. Expect further clearance 1600 Zulu. The uncorrected outbound heading, what's that going to be?
So just type it into Google Meet, guys, as you come up with it. What is the heading that you're going to fly when you're outbound in the pictured hold that you see without dealing with any wind correction? Just go ahead and in here in Google Meet, go to the chat and type it in. Let's see what you think.
All right, so most people seem to be saying 360. That's correct. Let's think about that. That's because the outbound leg is the 360 heading because you're flying away from the nav aid and you're flying away on the 360 radial. To be more precise, you're flying inbound on the 360 radial, so your inbound heading is going to be the reciprocal of that. I just gave the answer away, my apologies. Your inbound heading uncorrected is 180 degrees because you're flying inbound on the 360 radial. I understand that's confusing, but that's something you just have to stare at and wrap your mind around. That if you know that you're going to be holding north of Boston on the 360 radial, you know that because your inbound leg is always to the nav aid, you have to be flying a 180 radial inbound. Does that make sense to everybody? Because that's a really important point I want to drive home. Okay, I'm assuming it does. Now, let's say you're flying inbound and you're in order to actually maintain the 360 radial, you have to fly a 185 heading. What does that mean you actually have to fly on the outbound heading if you want to maintain that 360 track? Okay, somebody said 005. Any other guesses?
We'll give people a second to think about this. This is, again, complicated stuff. It definitely makes my brain hurt the first couple times I go through it. So take your time, think about some of the rules that we've talked about on previous slides. Remember, we talked about on the last slide that for corrections, you're going to double the amount of correction that you need and then reverse it as well. So in the last slide, we talked about someone who was flying 7 degrees left, and we corrected that by going 14 degrees to the right. So you got some 005, couple 350s, 1010, another 350.
Alrighty. Let's talk about this then. So if we know that we have to fly a 185 heading to maintain the inbound track, that means we are crabbing 5 degrees to the right on the inbound leg. We double that, we know that we have to crab 10 degrees and we reverse the direction. So we know that on the outbound leg, we have to crab 10 degrees to the left. So double and reverse the direction. And double and reverse the direction of 360 is 350. So now instead of crabbing 5 degrees to the right, we crab 10 degrees to the left. So a 350 heading on the outbound leg should work to maintain the constant track.
And let's look at the picture here. So I've got the wind showing for you in the diagram, which makes it easier when you're always tracking into the wind. So this is going to be a bit of an exaggeration, but on the inbound leg, effectively my heading is going to look a little bit like this. Now I'm hopefully going to be tracking right down this radial, but my heading is going to be slightly offset to deal with the fact that there's some wind at play here. And then again, when I'm on the outbound leg, in order to try and be on this perfect heading of, or track, I should say, of 360, I'm going to be pointing slightly into the wind. So here I'm on a 350 and over here 185.
Any questions on this? Okay. Now, let's talk about time. That's the more difficult part. What timing should be maintained on the outbound leg if the inbound leg takes 51 seconds instead of the desired 60? Let's think about this for a few minutes, and then I'll talk you guys through it. Somebody said 66. Any other guesses? Yeah, 6 seems to be a pretty common trend, and 66 is correct. Let's think about it. Your inbound leg actually took 51 seconds instead of the desired 60. That means there is a 9-second difference between what it actually is and what you want it to be. 9 seconds. Remember the rule? Take 2/3 of that. That's 6 seconds. And because it took shorter than you want it to be, you want to correct the outbound leg so it's longer. So you add 2/3 of the difference to your outbound leg. 2/3 of 9 is 6. Add 6. That means your outbound leg should now take 66 seconds. Any questions on this?
And I will say, in reality, these rules work out pretty darn well most of the time. I find that in the times that I've flown holds, well, mostly before the GPS days, you find this does tend to work. You do need to adjust a little bit. So when you've flown your first round, if you find that it didn't quite work, you'll add a little bit here and there. But by and large, these rules, at least in my experience, have tended to work pretty well. Has that been the same for you, Alec?
Yes, but by and large, these are very good rules of thumb. Yeah, these are good rules of thumb. They're not perfect because they're, nothing in aviation is perfect. There's always going to be a little bit of a wind change or a little bit of a wind shear or whatever, but they're very good rules of thumb, and they'll get you, if not exactly there, then damn close enough.
So is it basically that's always on the inbound that you're going to calculate that?
I'm sorry, ask that one more time.
Basically, you're always going to calculate that on the inbound portion of the holding pattern.
So you calculate everything with reference to the inbound,
Okay.
meaning, yeah, you adjust everything so that your inbound leg is perfectly aligned in exactly 1 minute.
Okay.
So the end goal is the inbound leg from the time that you roll wings level onto the actual track into the VOR until the time that you hit the VOR is 1 minute. And you're going to fly more or less time in the outbound to make sure that that 1 minute actually happens.
Okay. Okay. That's clear. Thank you.
All right, next example. You guys ready?
This one is
one's
me
gonna be
because you don't even get a picture on this one.
This one's going to be a little bit more challenging, but you don't get a picture in the real world, so you're not going to get a picture now, or at least not yet. Cleared to Putnam. Hold northwest on the 330 radial. Expect further clearance 1452 Zulu. And Matt asked a question, so calculate inbound and make the adjustments on the outbound. Yes, correct. All right, uncorrected outbound heading. Post that in the chat. Remember, uncorrected outbound heading. Yeah, most people said 330. That's correct. No wind scenario, you're flying outbound on a 330 heading. And in a no wind scenario, what's your uncorrected inbound heading? Yeah, very good. It's 150. No tricks there. Now, let's get a little trickier. Your outbound heading, let's figure out what that should be. If your inbound heading is 140, so you need to fly a heading of 140 to maintain the inbound track. What should be your outbound heading?
We'll give people a second or two to, again, think this one through and do the math and do the conversions. As we said, it's a little bit harder when you don't have that picture where it's showing where the wind is from, but at the same time, you don't get that picture in real life either. So we're looking at trying to figure out what is the correction that we are currently making, so the difference between 150 and 140, and then we need to double that in the opposite direction when we're flying the outbound leg.
All right, so a couple different answers. I see 310, 320, 350, 345, and the correct answer is actually, well, let's talk about it. If you're flying a 140 heading to maintain a 150 track, that means you're turning 10 degrees to the left to maintain inbound. So we double that and reverse it. That means on the outbound, you're now flying not 10 but 20 degrees and not left but right. So on the outbound, instead of a 330 heading, you're flying 20 degrees right. That's a 350 heading. Because think about it, on the inbound leg, the inbound course is 150. You're actually flying a heading of a 140. So you're flying to the left of your course. You also need to be flying to the right of your outbound course. So 350 heading on the outbound leg. Let's talk about timing, unless there are any questions. Let's say your inbound leg actually takes 90 seconds instead of the desired 60, so it's 30 seconds longer than you actually want it to be. What should your outbound leg actually take? How long should you fly for? I'll give it a minute or two, then I'll discuss it and give you guys the answer. Remember, your inbound leg is taking more time than you want it to. Okay, we see 75, 80, 40, 30, 1.2, I'm assuming that means minutes. The correct answer is 40 seconds. Here's why. If your inbound leg takes 90 instead of 60, that means we are flying the inbound leg 30 seconds too long. So we want to be closer in. So there's a 30-second difference. 2/3 of that is 20 seconds. And because we want the inbound leg to take less time, we subtract 20 from 60. That means we are flying the outbound leg on a 350 heading for 40 seconds. Does that make sense? I'm assuming that does. So lastly, the question is, from where is the wind blowing? Matt says north-northeast. Anyone else? People are saying north, northeast, east, from the northwest, from me, 150, northeast. Yeah, wind is blowing from the northeast. And you can figure that out because on the inbound, if you're crabbing into the wind, on the outbound, you're crabbing into the wind. You're always crabbing towards the east. So chances are the wind is blowing from somewhere from the east or the northeast.
So people are doing pretty well here. Normally when we run this ground school, and it is going to get more difficult, by the way, but normally we run this ground school and we get all kinds of answers. So you guys are doing pretty well following along. That's good. We've just spent now time talking about how to fly when you are actually in the hold. So this is all about the corrections for your headings and the corrections for your timing. We're now moving into a totally different section, which talks about how to actually get into the hold in the first place. And this is even more complicated than what you've just gone through, believe it or not. And it's something that you'll see a lot more often. So as we're about to go into hold entries now, we're talking about procedures that don't just deal with actually holding themselves, but now also with flying different kinds of instrument approaches, full procedures the way I talked about before. So this is a good moment to just pause and think about some of the concepts we've just talked about, because these won't necessarily come up again. We're now moving into almost a new chapter of this presentation where we're going to deal with actually getting into the hold in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. And someone in the comments said they're getting destroyed. Have no fear. This is an extremely difficult topic to teach, even more so in an online setting without a whiteboard. Even in an in-person setting, it takes a long time to get this point across to my instrument students. So by no means should you feel bad or discouraged that you're not getting it right off the bat on an online setting. This is not a perfect teaching scenario, and I would argue that of all of the instrument topics to be taught, holds and hold entries are arguably the most difficult one.
Yep.
Okay. Holds are great. You are in a hold. You guys now know how to fly them. Unfortunately, in real life, you're not going to be flying holds all that much. What you are going to be flying significantly more often are hold entries, specifically hold entries in lieu, hold in lieu of a procedure turn. This is common, this is arguably the more important of the two, so we're going to talk about it. Let's discuss the hold entry. They're relevant not just to hold procedures, but also to almost any instrument approach you're ever going to fly. 3 types of hold entries here: direct, parallel, or teardrop. For what it's worth, I've never heard the term offset before. That might be a Canadian thing, I'm not sure. But the 3 terms used in the United States are direct, parallel, and teardrop.
Yeah, you see offset more often in the ICAO world or in other parts of the world, which is why I threw it on there in case you hear that from any of your European or Canadian controllers.
Gotcha, yeah, I've never heard that one before. So, unless otherwise instructed, you have to report the time and altitude the first time you cross the holding fix as part of the entry, or when leaving any assigned holding fix or point. Any questions there?
And I guess I'm sure it comes up later on, but I will point out, I think I said this earlier as well, these are only recommended hold entries. So there is no, now correct me if I'm wrong, there's no regulatory requirement that says you're on this side of the fix, you must fly a direct entry. It's simply a recommendation based on the safest and most organized way to get into the hold. But from an actual regulatory standpoint, the only thing you really need to do is to stay on the protected side, the proper side of the hold that you are supposed to be on, which is protected by air traffic control for your operation. The method that you actually choose to do that is technically up to you, though of course when you're on an instrument check ride or the IPC that Andrew's going to need in the next little while, the examiner is going to be wanting to see a hold entry that would comply with the recommendations.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Just like a couple sessions ago, we talked about traffic pattern entries, how there's no legally required one, but there are objectively good ways of doing it. Same thing here. Yes, Mark, do you have a question?
And as he's typing here, I'll just say on our wings flights and when we're dealing with those kinds of scenarios, the hold entry can matter. So sometimes if we're dealing with a wings flight, we may tell you that the hold entry that you did was not appropriate. And that's most of the time going to be because you may have gone to the wrong side. You may have turned the wrong direction, done something that we weren't expecting. But again, from a day-to-day network perspective, controllers aren't going to be saying, you should have done a parallel, but you did it direct. That's not the kind of thing we're looking at. More what we're looking at is, did you stay where we were expecting you to stay? Were you at the altitude that we cleared you at?
Yeah, good point, Evan. And question from Mark. The first time you cross the hold, is that referencing the pattern or the actual first crossing? That's referencing the first crossing as part of the entry. Okay, I suppose we can go ahead and move on then. Direct entries are the easier ones to fly. We cross the fix and just begin the normal outbound turn. That's it. Actually, Evan, I think we forgot to mention something on the last slide. Let's go back one. Let's talk about the 3 different types first. Direct entry works for when you are on the side of the hold where you're going to be flying the hold, if that makes sense. So you are between 70 and what's the typical 110 degrees towards the side of the hold that you're going to be flying. And I know that what I just said made things complicated. I'm sorry. It will just make more sense once we actually do these examples. So that's the direct side on the right. You have the teardrop side, where if you imagine the hold entry, you have to you're on the unprotected side, you have to cross the fix, and you have to cross into the protected side. That's a teardrop entry. And then the little bit that we haven't covered yet is the parallel side, where you're on the protected side of the hold, but you have to make like a 180 or more turn to get to the hold. So instead of turning direct, you have to make a 180 and then turn into the hold. And we'll talk about all 3 of these.
Alex said a couple times protected side, and I've used that same term. What we're talking about when we say protected side is the side the hold is on. So the protected side in this example is here on the north side, and the unprotected side is down here. What we mean by that is if we give you a holding clearance as air traffic control, we're protecting this airspace for your operation. We expect you to fly on the northeast side of the holding fix in this specific example. We may have other traffic that's going in this direction at the same altitude as your hold. That would be a pretty poor job of controlling on our part if we did it, but we could, as long as they're a few miles away from where the holding pattern is. And that's why it's called a protected area. It's protected for you, and that's why it's critical to stay on the side that you're told to stay on. So this holding clearance would probably be hold southeast on the 291 degree inbound track to the holding fix, which is called socio. And you know it's going to be, therefore, an inbound track of 291. And if we're told to hold on the northeast side, that means that's where our protected side is. Down here on the southwest side or over here on the west side of the hold isn't specifically protected for this operation.
I would actually argue that this would be probably a southeast hold, but we're getting into semantics here.
Yeah, true.
Derek asks for a teardrop example, and don't you worry, we are going to draw an example for each of these. Let's talk about a direct entry. Direct entry, you just cross the fix and you begin the normal outbound turn. This is the simplest possible entry you can have. This is where you are already either lined up or close to lined up with the initial inbound course, so you can just fly direct the fix and then turn outbound. Easy enough. Parallel entry. You're on the protected side already, but you're flying the opposite way. You're basically flying what's close to the outbound heading. So remember that we always want to start on the inbound heading, or the inbound leg. So we have to make a 180-ish to return to the inbound track. So for a parallel entry, you cross the fix and turn outbound to parallel the inbound course. After 1 minute of doing so, you make a left turn towards the hold and intercept the inbound course, track it, and then start turning to the right, in this case, to just the normal hold that we discussed in the earlier slides.
So drawing this out, effectively you're coming down here. For just a second, of course, you're going to go on to that other side of the hold, but now we're going to make this big looping turn back around, and there's some argument as to whether you're supposed to come back in here and re-intercept, or if you can just go direct to the fix. But either way, that's what the entry looks like, and now once you've done the entry, you're effectively just in the hold. And now, of course, you're just flying your holding pattern as you would if you had done a direct entry.
Yeah, I haven't mentioned there's an argument for what it's worth. The way I've been taught and the way I teach my students is you turn left to re-intercept the inbound leg, and then you don't fly just direct the fix. But that's really, again, these are all recommended entries, so there's no clear-cut answer here. Mark asks, isn't it dangerous to be flying parallel to the pattern? Not necessarily. Number one, air traffic control probably assumes that you're going to be doing a parallel entry. And number two, you're already cleared for that hold. So you're cleared for that altitude, that protected side, and the inbound leg area is yours. So if you're flying outbound on where you would be flying the inbound leg, theoretically, there's no one there anyway.
Yeah,
Does
remember,
that make sense?
this is IFR, right? So air traffic control is here, and we are guaranteeing your separation. This isn't like a VFR traffic pattern where you might be worried about flying right at somebody. If there is anybody else in the area, they're going to be separated by at least 1,000 feet from you. So if we give you a holding clearance and you're at 6,000, 6,000 is going to be your altitude. Nobody else will be crossing through that altitude or at that altitude anywhere in this area immediately adjacent to the hold, particularly on the east and north side that you see here. And if there's, even in a high arrival volume situation, we might stack airplanes. So we might have one guy holding at 4,000, another one at 5,000, another one at 6,000. But we would never have two airplanes holding at the exact same altitude. And as we descend people, we would take the one at the bottom who might be at 4,000, and we descend them to 3,000 before we let the next guy who's at 5 descend at 4. So you're always going to be stacked by 1,000 feet or even more than 1,000 feet.
Mark, does that answer your question? Great. Parallel entries, Peter has a question. Presumably these all happen on even thousands to avoid VFR traffic at 1,000 plus 500. It happens at the round 1,000. I caution the word even here because that could be easily misinterpreted as 4 or 6 or 8,000. These happen at round thousands, yeah. So 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, 6,000, etc.
Yep. Arguably, you could be assigned to hold at 3,500, and there are times where on a missed approach procedure, for example, the altitude might be 3,500 or 5,700 if that's what the minimum safe altitude in the area is, and they don't want you to go any higher than that. So it is conceivable that you might be holding at a non-standard altitude, and then if you were assigned 3,500, we wouldn't have any IFR traffic within 1,000 feet of you, and probably the next closest person would be at 5,000. And of course,
Cool.
we're hoping if you're actually IFR, there wouldn't be any airplanes that are VFR in the area. But of course, ATC doesn't give you a protection from VFR traffic. So if you are flying IFR, but you can see outside, it's still your responsibility to see and avoid. And if you do see any VFR traffic that might not be talking to ATC, you might have to deal with them.
Alrighty, let's talk about the teardrop entry. Teardrop is when you are on the unprotected side of the hold and you need to make a 180 to get to it. So you have to cross the fix and get onto the protected side. It looks like a teardrop, hence the name teardrop entry. Cross the fix, turn to heading 30 degrees from the outbound course on the holding side, and after 1 minute, turn towards the inbound course to intercept. Any questions here? Okay, here's the hard part. We're getting to the examples. Hold entry. Clear to Putnam. Hold northwest on the 330 radial, right turns. Expect further clearance 1452 Zulu. Here, right turns is unnecessary because all turns are assumed to be to the right, but they're just a simple reminder here. So, here's how you actually determine it. Pretend you're currently flying due north. Start with your current heading. Identify the outbound, that's 360 in this case. Number 2, identify the outbound track that you want to fly. In this case, it's a 330 heading in a no-win scenario, so therefore your inbound is a 150. Segment, quote-unquote, your heading indicator, so break it up into 4 quadrants. 4, turn the horizontal segment 20 degrees in the opposite direction of the turns in the hold. So in this case, it will be 20 degrees left.
So we got right turns here. So we're just talking about moving this imaginary red line that we've got, the one that's right here, 20 degrees to the left.
And then determine which of the segments your outbound track fits into.
So in other words, what we're showing you here is a nice, easy trick. You don't have to be drawing out the hold, although you certainly could. You don't have to try and map it to those visualizations we showed you in the last slide. This is a really easy trick to figure out the right hold entry, no matter where you are, no matter what heading you're on. As long as you're pointing inbound toward the holding fix, you can use this trick to determine what should be the proper recommended entry. And so all you need to do is figure out your current heading. Well, that's easy enough. Figure out the outbound track to fly, which in this example, since we're on a radial, is 330. And then just figure out which of those 3 segments of your heading indicator, heading 330, the outbound track fits into. Because it fits into the section that says parallel, this is going to be a parallel entry. And that is effectively the simplest way that we could come up with of trying to figure out how you would actually enter this hold when you're getting a clearance on the fly with a couple minutes to figure out what you need to do.
Cool. Any questions on this before we move on and do some examples? Alrighty, segmenting the heading indicator. Elaine, did you have a question?
Yeah, if you were heading to 360 instead.
Pardon?
If you were heading to 360 instead, no, okay. If your VOR was 360 instead of being 330, so which one would that be? Would that be a direct one?
That would be either a teardrop or a parallel.
We'll have an example of that in a few minutes.
Okay.
Segmenting the heading indicator. So for a standard with right turns, you draw basically 2 lines. The vertical one and the horizontal one. Turn the horizontal one 20 degrees left, in this case 20 degrees counterclockwise. And there are your 3 sections. The smallest one's the teardrop, the second smallest is the parallel, the biggest one is the direct. Non-standard one with left turns. Again, draw the cross. Now turn it 20 degrees to the right in the clockwise direction. Smallest one's the teardrop, middle one's the parallel, biggest one's the direct.
That's an important one to remember. Which one's the smallest, which one's the middle, which one's the biggest. When you start to segment the heading indicator, notice how they've they flip in some ways. So here on this example, the P is on the left side because we have segmented the opposite. Here the P is on the right side. But again, the key is that the P is always the middle one, teardrop is always the smallest, and then the direct is always the biggest.
Alrighty, we're going to move on to some examples now. These are going to be a little tricky, but we'll get through them together, I promise. Alrighty. Well, and yeah, there's the outbound track and the inbound tracks there.
Just a couple examples of, I guess, different, where the different entries might fall is all we're going for here.
Alrighty, guys, determine the entry. You're currently heading 200. Your holding radial is the Boston 360 and standard right turns. What ought we do here?
And I can walk through this one as a first example, and then we'll give you guys the challenge next time. So here we've given you the picture, which makes it a little bit easier for us to visualize. And unfortunately, since you're not actually sitting in an airplane, most of the time we'll at least show you the heading indicator and give you some tips as we go through this. But effectively, just like we talked about last time, we're on the heading of 200. So that heading is on the top of our heading indicator. And we've segmented this. It's a standard right turn. So we've made that middle section of the segment go to the left, parallel being the middle of the three, and then the teardrop is the small and the direct is the big. This is how the actual hold would look. So there's the Boston VOR, the 360 radial, and the depiction of the hold. And now we need to figure out, well, what is that outbound track? So of course we know it's 360 since we're dealing with the 360 radial. And then the question is, where does 360 fit on your heading indicator? And if you can kind of do the math, 200 is around south, so therefore 360 should be somewhere around this side. And if that's the case, we're going to be dealing with a direct entry. So as we actually see that on the slide here, minus my little scribbles, we've got that 360 heading, that heading being the outbound track or the holding radial. Because it's sitting in the larger section, we know we have a direct entry. So what that would actually look like is this. We're going to step through a series of these examples over the next few minutes here. But before we do that, anyone have any questions on what we've covered before we actually start to see a few more of these examples? Again, the same process that we've looked through. Let's start with putting our heading on the top. Figure out the outbound track, which in this case is the radial 360. Figure out where that 360 radial plots on the heading indicator. And then depending on which segment it lands in, that's the entry we want to fly.
Any questions here?
Well, they're all experts, so they better get them all right.
Alrighty, example number 2. Determine the entry. Aircraft heading is a 030. Your holding radial is the Putnam 330. And again, standard right turns. So what do? First things first, we draw the heading indicator. So we put 030 up top. We know that it's a standard right turn, so opposite direction is left. Rotate it 20 degrees counterclockwise. Now we draw.
Before you say anything else, maybe let's give people the opportunity to use the chat again here and tell us what you think the entry should be based on these criteria.
Parallel, parallel, direct, parallel, direct, parallel. All right, let's think about this. Peter, have a good night. Alrighty, let's think about this. We know that we're flying outbound on the 330 heading, and we know that we are currently flying a 030 heading. So the outbound heading is 60 degrees to the left of us. So we can draw that on the heading indicator, and we know that falls in the parallel sector. And now if we visualize it on the actual screen, we're currently flying northeast. We fly a parallel entry, hook a left to join the outbound course, make a 180 plus some, so a 240-ish heading to intercept the inbound course, and then we just fly the hold. So a small left turn, big left turn to intercept, and then just right turns. Next one. Your aircraft heading is 200. Your holding radial is the Nantucket VOR 240 radial. Left turns, so non-standard.
And this time, I'm going to be mean and I'm not even going to give you the picture.
What are we thinking? Matt says teardrop. CR says parallel. Andrew says teardrop. Parallel, parallel, parallel. Parallel, parallel, parallel. All right, I think that's everyone. Let's draw it. Aircraft heading is 200. You're holding radial, Nantucket 240. You draw the outbound course, which is 240. And you know that your left turns non-standard, so you rotate the horizontal line 20 degrees clockwise. 240 is in the parallel sector, the middle one.
And so here we've thrown a trick at you a little bit, because if we were dealing with standard turns, and if we were dealing with the pictures we've seen on the previous few slides, then this would be the parallel sector over here. We would have rotated this guy like this. The parallel would be the big side. And so again, this would be what you'd be looking at in most cases. But we're not in that scenario today because we've got left-hand turns in this example. And there's your parallel entry.
We know this is a lot, so we invite you guys to ask questions if you're feeling confused at all, because I know that I was totally out of it. I had no idea what my CFI was saying when I learned all this stuff, so I invite you guys to ask those questions now if you have any. Mark says, I thought the radial always referred to the inbound track. It's actually, yes and no. The radial refers to where the inbound track is, but you always have to think of relation to the VOR. If you're flying on the, in this case, 240 radial, that's southwest of the VOR. If you know that you're always flying on the inbound track, then you have to take the reciprocal of the radial. So in this case, it would be 060. Alrighty, Keith asks, so parallel entries are left turn into the standard hold. It depends. It depends on whether you're a standard or a non-standard hold. For a standard hold, yes, they would be left turn. Matt asks, for some reason I keep thinking outbound on the radial. Left-hand turns would have flipped that south more. Okay. Are there any questions that I missed?
Just to make sure we get Keith's question there, I'm just trying to make sure I understood that correctly. So for a parallel entry, you're going to cross the holding fix. You're going to turn right initially. That's going to put you onto this section right here where you're flying parallel. Now you're going to make another big right turn. And then, of course, we're talking about a non-standard hold here. And then as we go back in, we're going to go this way. So this is for a non-standard left turn. And you would flip that if it was to be a standard turn. So instead of those right turns, they're both going to be left turns. And for sure, Dana, a good point to be able to draw that out. Again, I think if you're sitting in an airplane, you get a holding clearance with 3 or 4 minutes to actually figure this out. You may not have all the time in the world to do that, or even may not have a piece of paper in front of you. So the ability to segment the heading indicator pretty quickly helps. But for me, I always try to visualize it as well. And the GPS is a great tool for that if you have the time to plug in the hold, or even just, if you do have a kneeboard in front of you, to try to just draw out what does this look like. Because if you do look at the picture, even just looking at this depiction that we have up here, it does become pretty easy to see that from this side, a parallel entry is going to make sense. If I was to be coming from this direction and I tried to do a teardrop, this is going to be a really, really sharp right turn. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So being able to visualize it certainly helps you out. Couple more to go.
Okay. So now your aircraft heading's 290. Your holding radial is 360 off of Boston, and right turns as standard. Ladies and gentlemen, what is the hold entry? Teardrop, 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 direct, teardrop, or direct. Teardrop. Direct. And I would say that all of you are correct. If we draw the 290 heading up at the top, rotate a 20-degree horizontal line 20 degrees counterclockwise, and we draw the 360 outbound course, that ends up on the line. So it's within 5 degrees of the boundary, so either a teardrop or a direct works. Honestly, I would probably choose a teardrop here personally, just because I don't want to be cranking about a probably 120-degree turn to the left and then immediately have to start to fly one to the right. So I would probably do a teardrop here, but that's just me.
Honestly, I would probably cheat and do what the airplane does and just fly for a split second more past the VOR and then turn into the outbound heading and hope for the best.
Yeah, fair enough.
But I'm lazy. I agree that teardrop is probably a more organized way of doing things because you're going to effectively end up almost doing very similar to what you see in this picture. Your true teardrop is just going to take you out here, and then you're a little bit more established versus, as Alex says, to do a true direct entry, you'd have to crank it down here and crank it over here pretty quickly. The reality is you're going to end up doing some weird thing that looks like this and probably end up way out here. Can I draw the teardrop? Yeah, let me draw that again. So if you were going to, it does actually look quite similar, but effectively for the teardrop, you're going to want to pick a heading that is 30 degrees offset. So 330 is my heading. Fly that heading for 1 minute. You're going to end up right about here. And then at that point, you make a sweeping right turn to intercept the inbound radial, flying on a roughly 180 heading back toward the holding fix.
Any questions on this one?
This next one's got a nice trick to it.
Alrighty. Aircraft heading is 330. NGB is a hold 090 inbound track, standard right turns. What is the hold entry? Parallel, direct, 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 direct. Well, let's talk through this one. Your aircraft heading is 330, so we can just draw that right up at the top. Right turns, so draw 20 degrees clockwise. Now here's the tricky bit. Your NDB hold is along the 090 inbound track. So what is your outbound track? That's going to be 270. So this would actually be within the teardrop category. And we can visualize it like so.
The trick here is we were talking in every previous example about VOR radials, right? VOR radials, your actual holding clearance talks about the radial. In other words, they're giving you the heading or the track that you need to fly if you are going outbound. However, here we have an NDB hold. There are no radials with NDBs, very similar to an RNAV fix as well. There is no such thing as a radial off of an RNAV fix. So in our clearance, our actual clearance is going to say hold along the 090 inbound track. Because we're talking about an inbound track here, now we need to think about putting our outbound heading. So before with a VOR, we could just take that heading if it was, say, 270 and plop it right here. Here, we're actually dealing with an inbound track. We need to invert that to get 270, find out where that actually belongs in the picture, and find out that it's a teardrop. That's a tough one. Sounds like Andrew's got a question, so we'll give you a second to visualize that and to ask your question. And for those who are following along with us both here live and eventually on the recording, wanted to also point out that it is certainly a good opportunity for you guys to find this on YouTube afterwards and go through these examples at your own pace. You'll be able to actually pause the seminar, pause the recording, looking at this and go from there. That is a good point, though. I do think the slide has got it backwards with respect to the turn direction.
Yeah, it does. It should have been, the slide should have said left turns. Or non-standard left turns. That's a mess up on the slide, sorry.
funny, we've done this like, I think this is 3 or 4 years, and no one has got that, so nicely done.
Alrighty, moving on from that embarrassment. Almost done. Couple more. Aircraft heading is a 270. NDB is a 040 on the inbound track with standard right turns for real this time.
Hopefully.
Yes, it is. What is the entry? Parallel. That's what Andrew says. Teardrop, parallel, parallel. Parallel, direct. Ooh, got a good mix in. Direct. Alrighty, let's chat about it. If you know that you're currently flying 270 heading, one more parallel. NDB flies along the 040 inbound track. What's the outbound track? The outbound track is a 220. Draw that on your heading indicator. That is within the parallel sector. So this is a parallel entry. Now, last one, I promise. Determine the entry. Aircraft heading is a 170. Your holding radial is 330 with non-standard left turns. What are we doing here? Andrew says direct. Mark says direct, direct. Direct, direct. Direct, direct, direct. Everybody's saying direct. Let's talk about it. 170 is up at the top. Ooh, one teardrop. Let's spice it up a little bit. 170 is up at the top. The outbound course here is 330. Draw that on the heading indicator. It's going to be at the bottom. So you are, in fact, flying a direct entry. Does anybody have any questions on hold entries? Because that's all we're going to talk about them for now. I'll give it a couple seconds for people to type out questions, or at least say they have them, and if not, we're going to move on. Okay. Can you go back to the one that should be right?
I think that was this one.
Yeah.
Don't want to spend too much time on this slide. I know we are a couple minutes over as well. There's just a couple slides left once we're done here.
Would teardrop be a bad entry if that is using left? I'm kind of confused by that question. Oh, I see what you're asking. Yes. If it is drawn, if the slide is in fact messed up and you're using the left turns, in that case, yes, it would be a teardrop entry.
So I think what's happening here, just to make sure that I've got it right, is just the slide where it says right turns should say left turns, is the actual picture that you see is appropriate for a left turn entry. Like this heading indicator is segmented for left turns. This picture's for left turns. This should just say left.
Alrighty, last couple slides then. You're going to be holding for a while. Let's talk about fuel usage. Most holds are short term, so less than about 15 minutes, and you normally don't have to worry about fuel because hopefully you have plenty of reserves. With that said, if you're holding for an extended period of time, consider reducing power to conserve fuel. The most efficient configuration for holding is your aircraft's maximum endurance airspeed, which is almost always different than your best glide speed. And actually, that's something I learned about in my engineering coursework this summer. But if it's not published, you can estimate the max endurance pretty well, pretty accurately. With a propeller aircraft, it's about 75% of best glide speed. In a turbojet aircraft, it is best glide speed, give or take. Lastly, let's practice holds. We talked a lot about it tonight. Fly the full procedure instrument approaches that require hold entries in lieu of procedure turns, such as the one depicted. I believe this is the ILS-1 into Albany.
Yep.
You can request to fly the full missed approach procedures and hold as published. Air traffic control would only rarely say no. You can request a hold from air traffic control. And of course, our personal favorite, participate in Wings Over New England, our new training program where you will learn all of this and more. Does anybody have any questions on anything we have covered so far? Assuming that is a no, thank you very much for participating in tonight's ground lesson on holds. We know it was tough. This is probably the most nuanced topic we're going to have in this ground school. I encourage you guys to reach out to myself, Evan, or any other air traffic control mentor or instructor regarding questions about holds. We'll be sticking around for a couple minutes after the session to answer any follow-up questions. If not, have a good night, fly safe, stay safe, and wear a mask.